Let me introduce you to a brief summary of all of United States history. That's right, that country that keeps pushing its nose into foreign affairs? Yeah, that one. Mind you, this is simply a summary, and one does not simply put 300 years of history into one video. Well, until now. Let's start with the period before the United States. Sometimes it's hard to remember that the true Americans were diverse natives accustomed to mostly farming and cultivation. The term Native American is almost as broad as the term European, so it's kind of hard to generalize them. Anyway, they lived happily ever after, right? Wrong. Cue the land-hungry European. Along came the angry oppressors, explorers, that sought land and riches. Perhaps the most notable explorer was neither Vasco da Gama, who miraculously sailed all the way from Portugal to India, nor Ferdinand Magellan, who incredibly led an expedition around the world. But it was Columbus, who, despite not discovering anything and putting an entire race into perpetual slavery, is the only explorer we celebrate every year for his outstanding courageousness. Great. Along with exploration came guns, germs, and steel. Oh yeah, not to mention people, too. It's time for the colonies. Long story short, persecution, salvation, and riches were the main reasons for migration. Most of the land-hungry and profit-seeking men lived in the Chesapeake, specifically Jamestown, and the more religious settled up north. Going on to the eve of revolution, the French and Indian War was won by the British and resulted in huge land cession from both the French and the Spanish. However, the British decided to play a game by not letting settlers pass the Appalachians and the Proclamation Act. After the taxes, tea, and failure of representation, the colonists decided to YOLO it and form a new country, with the passage of the Declaration of Independence. Revolution started with Lexington and Concord, but the most notable battle was the stunning victory at Saratoga. This caused the French to realize the legitimacy of the US and opened way for intervention. Okay, the rest of the stuff is kind of self-explanatory. The Articles of Confederation were kind of weak, by kind of I mean really, and they decided to revise it, if revising means, utter destruction and reconstruction, thus creating the Constitution we know and misinterpret today. Et voila! The US was born. The differing opinions over the Constitution led to the creation of the Federalists, who wanted to expand the power, led by Hamilton, and the originally named Anti-Federalists, led by Jefferson and Henry. It seemed that back then people lacked not only government, but creativity as well. George Washington declined numerous attempts to make him king, established a policy of 2 terms. John Adams followed afterwards and extended the policy of not having war with Europe, despite the angry mobs outside his window threatening him. He then decided to shut everyone up with the Aliens and Sedition Acts. Thomas Jefferson followed, establishing an agrarian view of the United States and purchasing Louisiana to a slightly annoyed and in-debt Napoleon. I guess he short-looked that one. No. The Embargo Act, brought up against the British impressment of the US soldiers, attempted to stop the impressment, to no avail. This proved disastrous to the US in general. The US went willingly into the War of 1812 to prove its newfound power. Unfortunately, it ended horribly. Like, we often think of Canadians as peaceful maple syrup drinkers, but obviously this wasn't the case, and certainly not when the White House was, on fire and all. Fast forward a little and you'll find yourself at the Monroe Doctrine. It was basically the US's way to say, hands off Europe, I'm a big boy now, let me handle this. And Europe responded just like any other person would have. Yeah, whatever. And then came Jackson. Hated and loved by all, he led a campaign based on popularity. Strictly against the idea of nullification, he put down Calhoun's attempt to nullify a federal law. He also unfortunately brought up the idea of Indian removal on the Trail of Tears. The haters of Jackson formed their own group, the Whigs. Jackson's policies extended up to break the bank, causing an inevitable depression. Up until now, the United States was largely an agricultural country. A bunch of technological innovations in the north, namely the first textile mills, led to industrialization, also changing the lifestyles of many Americans. The clock, instead of the sun, began to govern workers' days, a habit still plaguing us today. Keep in mind these developments were largely concentrated in the north. The south, however, got the cotton gin, invented by Eli Whitney in 1794, and cotton soon became America's chief export in the south. Although cotton gin was invented with the intentions of helping reduce a slave's work, it ended up encouraging plantation owners to hire even more slaves. That certainly backfired. The Mexican-American War in the meantime became all the fuss as things became hairy over Texas. The US was like, we get it, and then Mexico was like, fine. And then the US was like, actually we also get this part in California and Arizona as well, so yeah. That didn't work out well. The Wilmot Proviso attempted to prevent these states from flirting with slavery, to little success. At this point, the party system had pretty much broken apart, because everyone in the South wanted slavery, while everyone in the North didn't really. Slavery now became a huge problem, especially in the Missouri Compromise. Then Kansas and Nebraska decided to all mess it up again, being located far above the line. And by the time the Compromise of 1850 came around, it was basically already over. Buchanan saw the last moments of Union and didn't do much to stop it. Along came Lincoln, and despite losing the first major battles of the war, soon saw a stalemate at Antietam and called it good for passing the Emancipation Proclamation. Then after Gettysburg and repeated Union victories, the United States glued itself back together, just in time to hear a gunshot and see a bleeding president. Our beloved and honest Abe was replaced by Andrew Jackson, who most everyone hated. He holds the record for the most overridden vetoes, with over half being overridden. Congress even reduced the number of Supreme Court justices just so that he couldn't appoint another. Reconstruction failed when a bunch of incompetent presidents were unable to address the issues of racism. After the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, Reconstruction absolutely stopped. We then enter a period of random presidents that provided little change. McKinley took a step out as the Spanish-American War provided another attempt to get a larger slice of cake in world affairs by scooping out the lands of Spain once again. The ensuing war in the Philippines proved to be a little bit more than an annoyance in the face of world affairs. This was because of empire. During this war, Theodore Roosevelt got his rise to prominence, and the parties attempted to subdue him by giving him the position of VP, but to no avail. McKinley died and Roosevelt established himself as a trust butt kicker. Reformists at the time, mostly known as progressives, pushed for better working conditions. Roosevelt went along with this, adding a little spice by establishing environmental efforts. He also started the Panama Canal and established his big stick policy in Latin America. Taft followed, reversing many of Roosevelt's efforts, and he got stuck in a bathtub. The battle for president went on as Roosevelt rose again, trying to beat Taft to the Oval Office. But the two split apart the party, leaving only Wilson and his tobacco-chewing goat to fill in the spot. Conflict started to boil in Europe. Historians will list a number of causes, which basically means they have absolutely no idea what the heck caused the war. One thing is certain, though. It did happen. World War I commenced in Europe, America stayed neutral. Britain made US angry, America stayed neutral. Germany continually used submarines to destroy American vessels, and the US was no longer neutral. The tactics of gas and trench warfare were used to fight, making war no longer a glorified pursuit. In the end, the Allies won with an armistice after shoving Germany back. Wilson tried to bring about the 14 points in his League of Nations, to which the French leader Clemenceau replied, "Mr. Wilson bores me with his 14 points. Why, God Almighty has only 10. However, it was accepted in this meeting. Embarrassingly, Congress itself completely rejected poor Wilson's League of Nations, leaving one of the few countries not included in it despite being its sole creator. A couple incompetent presidents followed after. The post-war society also saw a rise in anti-communism, a red scare that was indicative of the worst one to come later. However, the 1920s also saw a major rise in economic prosperity. Almost everything got better. The US, seemingly unharmed by the war, outpaced all other countries, many of which were in the battle-worn wars in Europe. The mass production of the automobile, the establishment of TV and radio, among other things, made the US world leader in economic and technological advancement. And everything was going great. Depression. The stock market crash, among other things, led to a huge panic, and following presidents simply ignored it. For example, Hoover took a relatively laissez-faire approach, which is not what you're supposed to do when depressions like that hit. FDR came along and was all like New Deal everybody with a whole crap ton of new legislation. Then he tried to pack the courts, which didn't work out all that well. After that, war commenced. World War II. The rise of Nazi fascism brought Hitler and Mussolini to the front stage. The US entered after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. But then the British left most of the fighting with the Germans to the Soviets, making Stalin very unhappy. With the iconic Operation Overlord and D-Day, along with many victories against the collapsing Germany, the war was almost won. After the war, Germany was split, which happened to be just a little bit of a problem later. Oh yeah, and the Cold War followed, an intense period of fear between the growing land-hungry Soviets and the rest of the world, weakened by the war. Truman issued a doctrine of containment, fought in a war in Korea, and then finished. Eisenhower did little to change this policy. JFK followed, as well as the civil rights movement. Johnson, LBJ, came along, bringing the legislation for civil rights, and, you guessed it, another war. Vietnam became extremely unpopular, and along came, you guessed it again, Nixon. Oh, how I hate you. He issued peace with China, but the main thing we remember him for is Watergate. He resigned and then left office with a terrible record with shame on his face. Ford followed, which was a terrible decision as he had no experience whatsoever and never even campaigned. An oil boycott in the Middle East led to an energy crisis, which Carter was then able to solve. Then Reagan came along. Reagan pushed to end the Cold War, solve disputes, and despite having a questionable fiscal policy, was able to miraculously bring the US out of the dumps. He was followed by another conservative, George H.W. Bush. A successful engagement in the Persian Gulf was overshadowed by a single quote. "Read my lips," he said. "No new taxes." And guess what? There were new taxes. Surprise! Bill Clinton followed, who turned out to be pretty awesome at most things, but was almost cut short by some questionable acts. And then George W. Bush followed, winning a narrow election against Al Gore. It's okay. It was an inconvenient truth. Attacks against the World Trade Center shook the foundations of faith and safety, leading to the creation of Homeland Security and the pursuit of the Taliban in the war on terror. Then came Obama, the first president of African American descent. Which leads us to the present day. What will become of the United States, the country only 300 years in the making? I guess we'll just have to wait and let history write itself.